Thank you both. That was really exciting. And I just got a text message from somebody that's watching remotely, just really appreciating the scope and the context of what we're talking about right now, because it's unfamiliar to a lot of people and it's very broad in scope. I'm both a moderator and a speaker on this session, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some things that that kind of connect me. I was on the working group that John was talking about, and it was really interesting how a working group comes together to come to consensus, and you cannot come to consensus. And there are good reasons for that. But how do you bring the people that are unregulated to the table and with hopes of wanting to try to do this responsibly? Because people like Dana don't want to die. I mean, they're not doing this so that they can harm themselves. They're doing it because they have a pretty significant health problem that they're trying to address, and the health system is not working for them. And so that's one case. I've been affiliated with the Quantified Self initiative. How many of you in here have heard of Quantified Self? So it looks like maybe about a third. So it's been around for about a dozen years. It's led by Gary Wolf. They're located in Berkeley, California. And it's really a community of people that have been doing self-study to answer their own questions about, not necessarily a disease. It might be, what is it about my everyday patterns that can help me run a better marathon? Or if I am using a keto diet, how does that affect my daily blood lipids? Not just the blood lipids that I learn about when I go to a physician once a year, but how can I intervene with my own body and make myself perform better, or even understand why I have a certain sleep pattern that's not working for me? So they wanted to do, so in Quantified Self, they do self-study, but it's a community of people that are supporting one another. And there was a couple years ago where Gary approached me and he said, we have a group that wants to do what we're calling participant-led research. These are people that have been doing self-study, but they want to do something together as a group. And some of them have some research training, some of them are MDs, they live all over the world. They really want to ask questions that they can better understand their daily lipids. But we don't know what we don't know in terms of how to think through this ethically. And we don't really have to have an IRB because we're not regulated, we're not funded, we don't have the common rule to rely on, and we don't really think an IRB is going to be helpful because they don't really understand how we're operating, and we don't fit the definition of research with a human subject. So if you think about what that definition is, it's a systematic investigation designed to generate knowledge. So about, and the human subject, it has to be about them. So it's about someone else studying somebody. And in this case, they're studying themselves. So they don't fit the definition of research because it's not intended to be generalizable knowledge, and they're not technically a human subject. So, but they really want to know, how do we do this responsibly and ethically? And they asked me, can you help us think that through? And I thought, this is great, I'd love to help you. At some point during that process, I was involved for about a year and a half, I started wondering, is it responsible for me to help them think through what's ethical and responsible? And so I was really having some quandaries myself. It was really a fascinating project. We actually published the process of doing responsible participant-led research in BMJ Open. It wasn't a study about human subjects, so they didn't ask us for an IRB approval. Another study where they were reporting daily lipid levels across each one of these single subject studies, the publisher wanted an IRB review. And they said, well, this isn't really research with human subjects. It doesn't technically apply. And the journal wouldn't take it. So they went to an institution and said, this is existing data. Can we get an exempt review? So they worked the system to get the approval they needed to get the paper published. And so we don't want people going underground. We don't want them working a system, but how do we support something that's happening and that people really want to do it responsibly and ethically, and they don't want to hurt themselves? So I just wanted to kind of frame that as an example of what we've been talking about. And also organizations like Sage BioNetworks. You know, when you accept federal funding to do research, you have the common rule. There are other occasions where you won't. And so how do organizations make that decision about doing responsible research as opposed to, we don't have to do that, so we won't. Eric, you have been talking about power and privilege, and I would like to have you expand on that a little bit. Like, what have you seen as the biggest gaps in your experience over the years working with people like Dana, Quantified Self? Where do you see the gaps in terms of power and privilege, and what are the next steps to meeting or reducing those gaps?
Yeah, I think that maybe the best way to describe this is to describe a bit of a story for myself, my own journey, and then hopefully you can see some generalizations from this. So Dana and I got a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, but a little interesting backstory. When she and I first met, it was when OpenAPS, there were 8 people involved in OpenAPS, and I met her at a conference, and I heard her giving a talk, and I was like, wow, that's amazing. And the first thing I went up to her was like, basically, how can I help? Maybe I can run like an efficacy trial or something on you. And she's like, no, that's not right. But she didn't quite say, she said it nicely, but the long story short, that this general pattern happened a lot, where I basically assumed I knew what I could do to help, and I ended up being totally wrong. So first, I was like offering one thing, no, we eventually calibrated and found something that would help, where she needed resources. She particularly wanted to focus on opening pathways to innovation, the name of our grant that we ended up getting. So that happened. But then second, at first I started playing the role of PI. Why? Because I'm classically a PI, right? And then after long conversations with our program officer, Paul Torini and others, we're like, wait, this isn't Eric's science, this is Dana's science. Dana needs to be the PI of this project. So another one of those moments of flips, right? This happened a lot. Let me give you two more stories. One is we had a convening of traditional and non-traditional experts, to try to explore this space and open pathways for innovation. And one of the things that we were explicitly working on was power and privilege, coming to this question, right? And so one of the things we did is we had people, we used this metaphor of first class versus coach class in an airline, and you can guess who we put into first class, right? The non-traditional researchers, and we put all of the experts, quote unquote, into coach. They were in a tightened into a table, first class. We gave them all drinks and all this other stuff, right? We were very explicitly trying to set up a power differential, right? So that was a key element. One of the other things that Dana did very wisely was assign me as a note taker. And at first I was like, oh man, I can synthesize, I can put things together. Why are you doing that? And in hindsight, I am so very, very grateful because it gave me a lived experience that I will cherish for the rest of my life. I basically realized me as a white male of privilege, my mere speaking would compromise the desire for equitable participation, contribution, and benefit. And so instead, I was assigned a note-taker role. Bear witness in silence. And that was the right role, I very much believe, for that moment, and it's something I've been very conscious about ever since. And I'll end this with one last part, and then I want to hit on the recommendation. But the last element of this, Dana, when we were finishing up the grants and stuff, like at one point, if you guys know the concept Dunning-Kruger effect, or I just like to call it confident ignorance, right? You don't know very much, and so you're really confident because your surface area of what you don't know is really small, right? So Dana and I were talking, and she's like, like when we first met, you were just kind of confidently ignorant. Now Dunning-Kruger effect was totally on you, but you've kind of grown beyond that, and now you're feeling, moving on that. So in particular, it's two things that I think I really started recognizing in myself, and I think now bringing in power and privileges. There's so many implicit biases that we're walking into. There's so many structural things that just give some people the status and other people not. That is so critical for us to be working on. And in particular, it's not just tokenism. It's not just bringing someone into the room. It's making sure that you've done the work to make sure someone feels comfortable, feels safe, and also make sure you work with those people who have traditional power to recognize that they might be falling into a trap of confident ingress and emotional blindness. And on that last part of emotional blindness, if you've never felt the thing that someone else is describing, I don't mean to bring up something that it can be a trigger for others, but think like Brett Kavanaugh. That's emotional blindness, not a good thing. I think a lot of us fall trapped to that. And if you never had that lived experience, right, it's very hard to then do something about it. So these are all variations of power and privilege that I think we need to basically we need to think a lot more about ourselves. Like as scientists, we are involved. It is not a purely objective thing to do science because humans exist.
Thank you. That's really important. I was thinking about the project with Gary and the participant-led research, and one of the things that they asked me to help guide their thinking about was, how do you help us think through all the risks that can go, everything that can go wrong with finger pricks? That's all that this involved was finger pricks. It could be 5 times a day, it could be once a day. So what can go wrong there? It seems pretty simple, right? And so when we were having that dialogue, I said, well, it's not just about the risks, it's about what are the potential benefits, and how do you think about benefits in relation to risks, and how do you think about what can you do to mitigate the risks that make the benefits a little greater. So it was kind of just that normal dialogue about the principle of beneficence that we talk about. But then I started thinking more about how do we demonstrate respect in a self-study? And that typically is demonstrated through the informed consent process, and that's something that is anchored in this, principle of respect for the person. And I said, so how would we do that in the self-study? What does that look like? And so it was a matter of developing a process for how do you consent yourself? And that had to be explicit. Like, how do you go through making a decision about what you want to do, what you don't want to do? What are the things that could influence that decision? Even though you're a group of people that kind of know each other, is there some coercion involved in not wanting to disappoint others in the group? So helping people think through all of that stuff was a really important part. And John, you talked about these organizations that exist. And John and I both gave a presentation on informed consent to the Citizen Science Association, which is an association that has a journal. They publish, they are working with a really global community. I'm on their ethics working group. So I've seen how these communities are coming together. With respect to the NIH helping to guide unregulated research, how do you see that taking shape? And what would it be composed of? How would it work?
First, I want to stop and thank Camille because a lot of what I'm going to say is influenced by our long friendship. So I think a lot of it starts with education. And this is something, when Camille, if you look at Camille's work, she's done a lot of work around educating people as to what clinical research actually is, right? What does that mean? Because it starts with that. Like, we've internalized so much of these concepts that we forget how you have to start at the very beginning and say to people, like, we gather data. That data gets analyzed. We make conclusions. Those conclusions aren't truths, right? They're claims, and they exist at varying degrees of truth over time. And so I think a lot of what the NIH can do is education, right? Investing in education. In the previous panel, there was an ask for funders. I would say fund education, right? It's very easy for the NIH to fund more R01s. If you took like 3 R01s and just funded education, it would help enormously. Another is very simple little thing would be, do indirects count as regulated research money? Because there's a lot of institutions in the United States who say that only their direct funding is covered by the common rule, and they claim their indirect funding does not get covered by the common rule. I won't name any of them up here, but if you want to meet me in the hallway, I can give you some tips. But this came out in the working group. Why should we follow the common rule when institution X is asserting that the research that's funded on indirect is not covered by the common rule? Clarify that, right? That would be nice. And then beyond that is a lot of the things that we heard from the DIY Bio and citizen science community was that they felt unwelcome in institutional context. They felt made fun of, disregarded, every sort of negative emotion, sentiment you can think about. Create a space, right, where you can meet with them as equals. Go to the Citizen Science Association meetings, right? Go take your lumps when they want to critique you for being calcified and institutional, which they will, and that's okay, right? Eric and I are considered calcified and institutional in those worlds. But create some boundary spaces where, to the power and differential point, where you can actually meet them as equals and say, what can we learn from you and what can you learn from us? That would be really useful. And then if we were ever to magically get legislative or regulatory action, create some safe harbors. I think we look for silver bullets in legislation and regulatory work, as opposed to resilience in spaces where we can tolerate some failure. And so, at SAGE, for example, I got an email this morning saying, can you host an N of 1 person's complete genome, proteomic, all of their chemo data, and so forth? And first I sent them to Open Humans, because that's the right place for it to go. But second, it always makes you think about the fact that we don't have any kind of safe harbor as a data hosting platform. None. Right? If you're in copyright space, you have Section 230. It's debated a lot whether it should be revoked or not, but that's the law that says you can actually run a crowdsourced platform from a copyright perspective, because if someone posts a Prince song and Prince is angry about it, you have 72 hours to take it down, and in that event, the platform is not liable for copyright infringement. There is nothing like that for any of these data platforms. We are all operating in a very gray zone, and having some clarity that says if you're trying to do the right thing, you're in a safe harbor and your damages are bounded would be nice. Right? We're a nonprofit. We apply the common rule out of an excess of caution. Right? We try to live up to all of these, the best of it, but we will get punished in the event of a failure just as badly as a malicious actor. That doesn't create a lot of desire to be the good person, because it's way easier to get caught when you're trying to be the good person. And so that would be my last ask, but I recognize that asking Congress to do things like that this year is probably a pipe dream.
Thank you. I have another question, but I want to go ahead and open this up to the audience. So if you have questions, go ahead and walk up to the microphone, and we'll start asking the audience for some input. And I keep thinking about, how would NIH be involved? Because that was, again, with the working group, it was like, okay, that, no more regulation, don't expand that regulation. How do we get people to be motivated to try to do the right thing, aside from, you could potentially die? And I think, you mentioned Open Humans, which I really think is worth acknowledging, because they've just done some incredible work. But this is a place where people are starting to conduct experiments. They have a data repository, and their community is actually doing the ethics review. And so it is important. They don't have to do it. They don't have the structures or the education or a lot of what we come here with, but they want to do it, and they're developing it. And so it's going to happen. How do we support it and be experts in a way that's useful to them? So I think that's really important. Alex, go ahead.
I'm still Alex Capron from USC. The discussion of self-study takes me back to the long tradition of auto-experimentation. And that, of course, was physicians using themselves as subjects. And part of that was a matter of convenience. And perhaps those who became researchers were more risk tolerant. But part of it was also a notion that if you're doing it to yourself, no one else should complain about it. And Hans Jonas, in his famous 1969 philosophical reflections on experimenting with human beings in Daedalus, in talking about the limits of experimentation, suggested that one way of thinking about this was that the researcher should be the first subject. And it wasn't in the Nuremberg version that would make sure that you weren't doing something terribly unjustified, because you wouldn't do that to yourself. It was that the subject, the researcher's subject, is the most identified with the aims of the research. Not simply that he or she would understand it better, and so the consent would be more informed, but that identity between what you're doing and adopting the goal of doing it was an important ethical justification for going ahead. But he was raising it in a context in which he wasn't against going slowly. I mean, he famously in that article says, you know, there's no moral imperative to do the research to advance simply because they're suffering. That it is not something that people with a disease want to hear, but in fact, not at least doing what we can already is a wrong, but increasing knowledge is not a moral imperative in his view, if it comes at the cost of other important values, which of course were still much fresher in people's mind. But I want to know whether in your discussion of the self, the N of one, and people being their own citizen scientists, participant, personal scientists, whether any of that resonates with you, because it seems to me that they also are so identified with the goal of the research.
Yes, and I think that there's a huge caveat, which is who has the power and privilege to be able to ask the questions? You know, and so this is why right now I started with OpenAPS, you know, and Dana would be, actually when she and I first were talking about developing the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grant, she was like, this is her speaking, I sit in a place of power and privilege. I have the capacity to do this. And one of the things I want to make sure we're doing in this work is making sure we're open, hence the metaphor we ended on, opening pathways to innovation for everyone else. And so, yes, and this is why, like, for me, I brought up other ones. I only just alluded to them, but like community-based participatory research, youth participatory action research networks, PCORI, right? There's a lot of methods where I think we've already got seeds of this in the work, right? Where we're trying to build a context to build capacity to allow people to use research, very broadly defined, to support their needs and their practices. And this is ultimately coming right back to when I was bringing up the optimization function within engineering, right? It's like, in my mind, the power spot is who defines success. And how do we make sure everyone has the capacity to take part in answering that question, what is success for me and for the collective? And being able to work at those many layers. But then the last layer of this, coming back to it, it's like there are such structural biases that don't make it possible for most people to engage in that. That's the huge functional problem. Like, back to Dana's point, she had the time, the resources, the network. She was a communications degree. She knew how to communicate well with others to form teams and communities, right? There's a lot of people who don't have all of those powers and privileges, right? And so what it sets up is very much, this very easily could go down a path of actually further propagating structural inequities. And that's the thing that scares me the most. But in my mind, the answer is not what I think we often do, institutionalize and solve problems for people. We've seen that working with AIDS, with like trying to do AIDS work from afar, where like we drop rice into someone's property and we're like, here, I fixed your eating problem. Oops, I just broke your economy. Shoot, right? People know their own context. They know themselves. That's what we need to be building the capacity for the people who have that lived experience and that expertise of themselves and their context and their community to drive the research questions.
Oh, thank you. Be brief on that. This is a really interesting question because one of my students, an MPH student who's really interested in studying her own pain, wanted to design a self-study, and because she's a student and she's at a university, she wanted to put it through an IRB. And when she looked up what the definition of self-study was, it was all about physicians or somebody researchy studying about themselves. They belonged to the university, and so the IRB's context was that. They had no idea why she would want to do a self-study. It didn't make sense. She was, don't do that. That's not real. So I think more about not the physicians who have studied themselves and gone on to win Nobel Prizes, but the citizens, the students that really want to better understand their own lives in the context of their health, and that we're not supporting that. We're not organizationally supporting it. And another colleague who went to a prestigious university who has this enormous, beautiful data set, who the academic wanted to partner with her, they said, well, that data set, I don't think that's No, you can't, that's not going to be a data set that you can use for existing data even, because it just didn't seem like it was collected appropriately. So there were some questions about the ethical collection, and these were people that volunteered their data, so it could be used by others. Very good intentions. John, do you want to speak on that at all?
Just to sort of, if we don't start by dealing with the structural issues, in my opinion, we are going to really quickly wind up in a world in which people who look like me can do self-study that's relatively ethical and free of surveillance. But people who don't look like me will have to buy into consumer technology platforms that repurposes their data in ways that are not related to this and that are often going to be used for modern forms of redlining. I mean, if you look at something like, when we first started with ResearchKit, Carl Elliott, who's a bioethicist in Minnesota, within 5 minutes of my talking to him, is like, they're going to give people phones or watches for free and turn their data plans off if they don't comply. And people will feel an obligation to do it because it's a nicer phone than they can get otherwise. The Apple Heart Watch study is giving people subsidized watches, right? Like, this is where we're at. And so the freedom to do this kind of research unsurveilled by the rest of the capital economy, which Deborah was talking about a little bit earlier, that's a freedom that is going to have to be structurally built in or it won't exist.
And I think we get back to principles also, and that our traditional principles, they are fine. We don't need 85 new principles. We need practices, and our practices have to evolve with this changing ecosystem. Ben.
Yeah, Ben Will from Seattle. Actually, your comment is actually where I was going too, Camille, because I think since we're supposed to be thinking of what are the things that NIH could do for funding, I'd like to hear the reaction of all of you about this, what was initially framed as oversight, as regulation, but I think could be framed as oversight. And it applies not only to what you described, but also to the last session earlier. It's an issue in QI activities as well. And so what do you think about the idea of trying to study, evaluate, develop different systems of oversight that could be useful for not only citizen science, but for mobile health and a variety of other things?
I'm going to take that for just 30 seconds and pass it on to you guys, and this will probably be one of our last comments. And it gets also at one of the questions from the last panel about how is it patients will choose to opt in or opt out. And one of the things that we haven't done well is included people in the conversation. We're not engaging patients in this conversation. We're not asking them what they understand about their data, what they understand about who wants to access it, what they understand about what can be learned from it. And so I think one of our first steps gets at the principle of justice, which is who's being excluded, who's at the table, who stands to benefit. And so we can use our existing principles, but we need to engage the community authentically. Often, they should not be part of the conversation, oh, let's go to that community and get their input, but they need to be part of this conversation. So if this were the first meeting of a discussion about how bioethics and research should be happening in the future, this room should have more people in it that are not us.
One of the cliches that I'm working on perfecting is that I think we've confused the principles of bioethics with the process of bioethics. And so we don't say, I meaningfully thought through the risks and benefits and informed people. We say, I got an IRB approval. I used our consent form. And I think the principles that we're working with don't need to particularly change, to echo Camille, but we've confused them with following a very specific institutional process. And that's really awesome if you're on the inside of an institution, because then you don't actually have to think about whether or not you did a meaningful job informing people. A lot of the times when we do work at Sage, we get critiqued because we're adding transaction costs. People aren't going to enroll if you tell them that. We're like, right. That's, someone who says no at the end of a consent process is a successful consent process, right? But everyone wants engagement. Everyone wants more enrollment, right? This is every study we're involved in. And so, reinforcing those principles as opposed to saying, well, it's okay because I got an IRB approval or I used our existing consent form, right? Defend the process. Sorry, defend the principle, not the process. And I think that's a mistake that we've made. And I would love to see NIH coming back to those principles and sort of defending those and saying we need to find new processes and new practices that implement them, I think is where we ought to be going.
Knowing we only have 45 seconds, I'll end. I think there's a yes, and a principle that I think we need to be mindful of is the organizational structure on how we facilitate that. So picture three structures. One structure is centralization, where it's basically we have the one king to rule them all type of logic, right? A second structure you can think about it is basically breaking those into little subgroups. A third to start thinking about it more in terms of a network logic, right? Where you want to be building resiliency. And I personally, what I'm thinking when I think about regulation is more of like, how do we build resiliency of network? And ultimately, the way I think about that is building countervailing forces. It's not about having the one thing to say you're being ethical. It's about building different groups with different powers that together, it is actually, they are stronger together because they are valuable countervailing forces. You want diversity, you want resonance. You need those two things to be fighting all of the time, right? Which is, so second, the first step in my mind is understanding how to balance those powers, hence why I was bringing up like there's systemic biases where we will never get the power balanced enough, which means that we can't have that second type. But if we can create safe havens, like John was saying, you might be able to actually build this space to start using more of a resilience-style, network-based, countervailing force logic of regulation.
With that, I'd like to thank you all for participating in this session. We now have a lunch break, and it looks like Jeff's going to tell you about it.
You were exactly on point. So we'll reconvene at 1:15. The cafeteria is on the third floor here. I think we want the planning committee to get their lunch, and then we're convening in 103 for a brief discussion. The rest of you can go out and enjoy whatever the day looks like outside. We'll see you 1:15.